Welcome back to the Scholar's Circle. I'm Doug Becker. Joe Biden campaigned on promises to reverse many of Donald Trump's immigration policies. The new American president signed 3 executive orders to alter the previous administration's immigration policies, as well as outline a new approach to amnesty and residency for foreign nationals in the U.S. We discussed the content of these executive orders, what's expected to develop in the upcoming weeks, and the future of American immigration policy on this segment. Our guests are Hiroshi Motumura, who is the Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's authored many books, including Americans in Waiting, The Lost Story of Immigration and Citizenship in the United States and Immigration Outside the Law. And Joanne Lin, who is National Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs at Amnesty International, USA. Joanne Lin, we'll start with you first. Can you give us a synopsis of the executive orders, what actually has changed in policy?
Sure, good to be back with you. Amnesty International welcomes President Biden's executive orders announcing steps toward protecting people seeking refuge in the United States. We applaud the president's rescission or cancellation of the Muslim ban and the Africa ban, which had been imposed by the Trump administration. We also welcome President Biden's orders to launch a task force to reunite separated families at the border, to address factors pushing people to flee in search of asylum, to support stronger asylum and refugee protection in other countries, and to build refugee resettlement capacities in Central America. President Biden announced a new executive action that addresses the global refugee crisis by committing to rebuilding the U.S. refugee admissions program. Trump had taken a wrecking ball to the U.S. refugee program, slashing refugee numbers to all-time historic lows. And President Biden has now announced plans to restore and increase refugee admissions to 125,000 per year by September 2022. Amnesty International also applauds the historic step that the president has now taken to address the needs of those forcibly displaced by the climate crisis, whether it's farmers who have permanently lost their capacity to grow crops, or villages that are now literally underwater. People across the world are being displaced by climate change and are on the run in search of safety.
And Hiroshi Motumura, what are some of your impressions of these initial moves that the Biden administration has made in what's been a pretty busy first couple of weeks?
Well, I am not surprised that the Biden administration has moved quickly on these issues. It's not just the executive orders that we're talking about, but also even on day one of the administration to push for legislation or to get legislative process underway. So that doesn't surprise me. I think that the whole area of immigration, refugees, it became, of course, a big point of emphasis for the Trump administration, and it was very much part of the Trump playbook was to use migration issues to incite and excite his base. And so it doesn't surprise me that the Biden administration is going after that area quite a bit. It's partly to push legislation that wasn't going anywhere. It's partly to do things to reverse the executive orders that the Trump administration adopted, not just formal executive orders, but all kinds of policies that didn't rise to the level of a formal order, but really mattered. And also, I think, to change the narrative. One of the things the Trump administration did was to remove the idea of or the phrase nation of immigrants from one of the major immigration agencies. And so what we're really talking about is an attempt not just to roll back or to reverse what the Trump administration did legally, but also to shift the entire narrative.
Now, Joanne Lin, I know that human rights groups had been particularly critical of Trump administration policies. One question that consistently seemed to come up is how different was the Trump administration from previous policies? I know, for instance, the question about so-called kids in cages, one of the defenses the Trump administration laid out was that they weren't the first to start this, that this was a continuation of a policy under Obama. Is it fair to say the Trump administration's policies were really quite distinct and quite different, or was it a continuation of American immigration policies?
The Trump administration adopted wholesale policies that no other president has done in the past, most notoriously family separation along the southern border. And that practice was designed to so-called deter Central American families from coming to the United States, including many in search of humanitarian protection, people on the run for safety and protection. And it was the first time at such a wholesale, writ large level that the US government forcibly stripped children from their parents. And even now, several years later, several years after the Trump administration actually sought to end the policy, there are anywhere between 600 and 1,000 children who remain separated from their families. These families' lives are permanently damaged, and the emotional and mental toll on these children is truly indescribable and incalculable, which is why President Biden has made this one of his top priorities coming out of the gates. But importantly, the US practices on immigration and asylum, the dark history doesn't just start with the Trump administration. So certainly the practice of mass family detention, which we saw imposed nationally, that started in 2014 under the former Obama-Biden administration, where we saw the overnight construction of mass family detention facilities in Texas run by private prisons, where you have children and their parents, their moms for the most part, locked up together in immigration jails. And I want to be very clear about this. These are people who have come here, and voluntarily made their whereabouts and arrival known to immigration authorities so that they can apply for asylum, which is a form of protection here in the United States. It's a legal form of protection, and there is a system of due process that these people are entitled to go through. And so that problem or that situation has certainly predated the Trump administration. I do want to note that while the Biden administration has made several important strides and advances to try to reverse the damages of the Trump administration, it has not done that completely. And so, for instance, if you look at the Remain in Mexico program, a very controversial program, also known as the Migrant Protection Protocols Initiative, this is a Trump initiative that has forced asylum seekers to wait in northern Mexico for months on end at great peril. Human Rights First has documented that over 1,300 asylum seekers forced to wait in Mexico under this program were later kidnapped or attacked while waiting in Mexico. And to be clear, these are people who are entitled and should be admitted to the United States while they're presenting their asylum claims. But the Trump administration had forced them to wait. On day one, Homeland Security, this is on January 20th, 2021, Homeland Security announced that they were going to suspend future processing of under Remain in Mexico. However, thousands of asylum seekers remain stranded in Mexico. People who've been waiting in recent years and months remain there where they face great danger. And Amnesty International is calling on the Biden administration to immediately bring these people to safety in the United States so that they can present their asylum claims.
And Professor Motomura, one of the things that strikes me about this is how much of the policy has been generally set by executive orders. You had indicated in your initial remarks about the need for legislation. What ultimately should be legislated and what can comfortably be changed via executive order? Because I think one of the real concerns here is kind of a whiplash in immigration policy, where this policy changes so dramatically as a result of who the president is.
Yeah, well, certainly we've seen that with Trump being as active and aggressive as he was for 4 years, that this lot can be done by executive order or other types of presidential decree without legislation. So a lot of the issues that we have in migration policy in this country are susceptible ultimately only to solutions that would change actual laws in terms of statutes, in other words, legislation. And so, for example, one of the things that the Biden administration has started to push is a bill that would provide legal status to most all people in the country without legal status. legalization program. It would consist of different phases. So in other words, people who are recipients of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, they would be on a faster track to getting green cards, in other words, lawful permanent residence and then citizenship. And so at that level of actually granting permission to stay in the country legally, indefinitely, and then being on a path to citizenship, that's going to require legislation. Another thing that I just want to point out is that this dovetails in a different way to what Joanne was saying, is that the Biden administration is trying, I think, at least modestly, or maybe in small terms, to try to resurrect attention to the reasons why people feel forced to leave and make perilous journeys to the United States due to conditions in their home countries. And so the idea of international economic development in Central America is something that's going to require a different kind of legislative action, which is appropriations. So that's important. But it's always been true that a lot of immigration law on the ground, what really happens is a matter of discretion, a matter of enforcement, a matter of priorities. And so I think it's important that there be legislative change, but no matter what, it's going to matter who makes these choices about, for example, if you look at migration protocols, migration protection protocols in Romania and Mexico, a lot of this really has to do with taking a system, which, as Joanne suggests, is really established in law, international law and US law, and really make it work, right? So some of this is going to require making sure that people get hearings in a timely way. I think it's important also that they have the assistance of lawyers to help navigate the process. And so there's got to be both legislative change, but it also is always going to matter who's in the White House, because so much of what really happens is bureaucratically and detailed on the ground. For example, a lot of attention has been paid, and rightly so, to the infamous Muslim ban, African ban, at sort of the broad level. But we shouldn't also forget that processing, that so-called invisible wall, making people wait forever, requiring interviews that have never been required before. These are small things, but they're at presidential discretion and agency head discretion. But that's a point of attention that the new Department of Homeland Security Secretary is going to have to pay a lot of attention to in the coming years, and hopefully sooner than that.
It may jump in for a moment. You're absolutely right that, the immigration law and system has been like on a pendulum for years, if not decades. And the people who pay the greatest price are immigrant families and communities. As Hiroshi mentioned, for instance, while President Biden has rescinded the discriminatory, xenophobic, Muslim and Africa bans, there's nothing that prevents a future president from coming in and reimposing them or imposing new additional bans. So Amnesty International is calling on Congress to pass what is called the No Ban Act, which would permanently check any president's ability to impose bans that discriminate based on religion. So it's critical, like we're urging Congress to do that it's not sufficient for Biden just to erase what Trump has done, because we have seen how easy and how devastating those bans can be. On the legislative front, yes, the president has announced that he has sent a bill to Congress. There has been no legislative text yet seen or introduced. The Democrats have a very narrow majority in Congress. It's razor thin in the Senate. It's basically 50-50 with a tie settled by the vice president. And then the Democrats in the House have a weakened majority since they lost seats in the 2020 November election. But I think it's absolutely essential that this Congress take up immigration, at least in some form, to try to fix these longstanding problems that Hiroshi mentioned have to be addressed by the legislature.
You're listening to Scholar Circle. I'm Doug Becker. We're discussing the Biden administration's new immigration policies with Joanne Lynn of Amnesty International and Hiroshi Motumura of UCLA. So Hiroshi Motomura, the Trump administration altered several of the conditions that had been previously issues raised for asylum, including gender-based violence, potentially asylum from climate change or from family conditions. Are these expected to be changed under the Biden administration?
Well, I think that if you take a step back and just think about this, not so much even the 50,000 foot level, but maybe the 15,000 foot level, the Trump administration was really on a mission in some sense to try to gut the system of asylum and refugee protection in the United States. I mean, it did a lot of things that the courts blocked and a lot of things that the courts didn't block. But the Trump administration's basic attitude, I think, was that it was going to make it as difficult as possible to apply for asylum. And so it did a number of things. But one of the things it did that you just alluded to is it adopted some rules by attorney general decision, actually, that make it harder to win asylum cases based on gender-related violence would be one, based on membership in a family that's being persecuted would be another. And so, that's one area where those decisions can be reversed. Another one is simply doing away with the Remain in Mexico program. Another one is to allocate more resources to actually hearing people's cases. Another one is to treat people humanely while their cases are pending. Another is to not try to shunt asylum applicants to other countries where they actually don't have an opportunity to secure protection that they would have in this country. This is something that took place on many different fronts. I think the Trump administration worked in many different angles on this. It's something that requires, I think, both immediate attention, and yet at the same time, it's going to take time to undo the various pieces. Some of it is going to require legislation to really protect. Some of it is going to require appropriations, but some can be done by reallocation of resources. I also, I'm concerned that a lot of the rank and file here in these agencies are going to resist or at least drag their feet on some of these changes. I think one of the things the Obama administration confronted was the fact that he was trying to rationalize the system of enforcement in ways that I think drew a lot of valid criticism. But I also think that the good things that Obama was trying to do were resisted in many respects by the rank and file. And so I think Biden will have that same problem.
No doubt that President Biden is going to have an implementation challenge in Homeland Security for the reasons that Hiroshi mentioned. And in particular that, I'm not speaking about everyone in Homeland Security rank and file, but the most, I would say, anti-immigrant ranks inside that agency have really had their moment under the prior administration and are going to be fighting tooth and nail to defend and keep in place the initiatives, and there were many, that the Trump DHS was able to put in place.
So, Professor Motomura, one issue that certainly arises frequently when discussing immigration questions is the future of DACA. What's expected as the future of DACA? Will it continue to be an executive order? Can it be passed as legislation? Or is it likely to face quite a bit of opposition?
Well, one of the things that Biden has really pushed or said that he would push, and I mean push in the sense of advocate for, is to include the DACA recipients in legislation. But what they would get from legislation is something that DACA itself as a executive action couldn't give them, and that is that this legislation would provide lawful permanent residence, a durable immigration status, in other words, a lawful status for DACA recipients, and then put them on a path to citizenship. And so that is one piece of legislation. I think what we're going to see in legislation is that it's going to be a long negotiation. It's going to be a difficult negotiation. It may well be that the DACA recipients are the group of people that benefit from this legislation that probably has the highest chance of making it through the process with green cards and a path to citizenship. I think it'll be easier politically to give green cards to DACA recipients than to a much larger group of people who are undocumented. This is just as a political matter, but it's going to require legislation. Now, the other question that's maybe part of your question is, what happens in the interim, or what happens if legislation doesn't pass? In other words, what happens to DACA as DACA? DACA, you have to remember, is not a permanent status. It's kind of a quasi. It protects people from deportation. It comes with work permit eligibility, but it's subject to 2-year renewals. And it's not, and there are some discretionary denials of DACA, and so I think the Biden administration is committed to keeping DACA and to actually to broadening it. I mean, he uses the word to fortify DACA. The one problem with that I should mention is that DACA is the object or the target of a legal challenge that's now pending in the state of Texas in federal district court. And so we'll have to see what happens in that case, because the argument being made by the state of Texas and a few other states is that DACA is illegal, as beyond the power of President Obama to adopt it in the first place. I mean, I think that's entirely wrong, that argument, that I think there's all kinds of legal reasons why DACA is quite legal. But we may see a situation where the judge issues a decision that requires some modification of DACA. And of course, that will go through an appeal process. So that's a complication. But I think the Biden administration is committed to keeping DACA as DACA and trying to get a more permanent legislative solution.
So our final question, Joanne Lynn, what ultimately do you recommend the Biden administration prioritize in these changes in immigration policy?
So there are 4 things that the Biden administration can and must do immediately. The Biden administration needs to swiftly end the Remain in Mexico program, also known as Migrant Protection Protocols. They just need to dismantle it altogether and bring in all the people who are waiting on the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border to ensure that they have access to a safe and humanitarian process for their asylum case. Secondly, the Biden administration must stop misusing the public health authority that was invoked by the Trump administration to block and turn away asylum seekers and migrants. This is public health authority that has been invoked during the time of COVID. And the Biden administration has said from every platform possible that they are going to listen to the science, follow the evidence, and there is no medical basis or public health basis to justify the blocking and expulsion of asylum seekers and migrants based on public health and COVID. Third, the Biden administration must end mass family detention. This is a carryover and legacy of the Obama administration. It is an anathema and an affront to human rights and to our country's values. The last time we had children locked up with their parents in incarcerated settings was during World War II, when Japanese American families were rounded up and held in detention camps. Biden has to end this scourge. Fourth, Biden needs to release people in immigration detention. Again, these include children, families, asylum seekers who are being locked up in punitive jail situations. There is a COVID risk for these people who are, by definition, in settings that are imprisoned, where they cannot socially distance and cannot implement the public health measures necessary. And this is also, again, contrary to our values and not necessary for public safety. So those are the 4 measures that the Biden administration can and must immediately take. And Amnesty International is going to hold the administration's feet to the fire.
We've been discussing immigration policies, specifically the new executive orders issued by President Biden and proposed changes to U.S. immigration policy with Joanne Lynn of Amnesty International. She's the National Director of Advocacy and Government at Amnesty International USA. And Hiroshi Motumura, Susan Westerberg Prager Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's the author of many books, including Americans in Waiting, The Lost Story of Immigration. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you to our guests and to you for listening. The Scholars Circle team includes Doug Becker and Lillian Ng, contributing hosts, Ankine Agasian and Melissa Chiprin, managing producers, Sud Dongre, our webmaster, Tim Page and Mike Hurst, engineers and technical support. I'm Maria Armudian, and we'll see you next week.